American government on Monday, September 21st, 2020. After our intensive review of the Constitution last week, we'll now turn, really for the rest of the course, and examine the issues and tensions within the constitutional system that we have seen erected and put in place during the last month. We'll begin with the issue of federalism, the proper division of authority between the national government and the states. Now, I have to admit that I've been teaching American government for a long time, almost 40 years, and this is typically what you could call a yawner for undergraduates. It doesn't seem to be the most interesting issue in American government, and yet, following Wilson in Chapter 3, it's important to remember that this issue has probably been the most contentious issue in American life. As Wilson points out, and as we'll see, it has framed almost every major conflict in American life since the beginning of the Republic. We'll see that, for instance, the first great divisive political issue that faced the nation in the first decade of its existence, the creation of a national bank. Now, again, for modern Americans, it's almost impossible to see why that was such an issue. But as we'll see, that issue raised the question of where Americans were to find the thrust of their existence, really, the states or the national government. And of course, it involved the question of the interpretation of the powers of the national government. This issue dominated American life for almost 20 years, and we'll see that in one of the first great court cases, which the Supreme Court decided, which really decided the fate of the nation, McCulloch v. Maryland in 1819. This issue was still a hot-blood issue into the 1820s and 30s. Then you could say a different issue then arose on the horizon, and that, of course, became the conflict that emerged into the Civil War, the issue over slavery, which in some ways was articulated as a states' rights issue. In some ways, the growth of the economy of the United States and the growth of a national economy raised the question of the proper scope and authority of the states and the national government, and that came to a head to some degree during the Depression, which led to, in some ways, the massive growth of federal authority that we've seen in our generation and the past generation. I'd go so far as to say that still the question of finding the proper balance of authority between the states and the national government is still really, in some ways, at the heart of our national life. In some ways, that was the question, as Wilson points out, in Obamacare and setting up national health care, whether or not this was properly a state issue or a federal issue. Aspects of the immigration crisis have fallen out along these lines, too, with states, for instance, invoking sanctuary, either sanctuary states or cities, to resist certain aspects of the national government's immigration policy. So this, and the last major article that we'll read on this section for Friday by William Schambra, I'm going to make the argument that again, the differences between the two parties, insofar as there are consistent and core principles that divide them, probably has to do with whether or not they want to increase the focus of the national government in our lives or increase the focus of state and local government. So we'll try to see why this is an important issue. First, let me just remind you of how this issue exists. Remember, the choice at the founding was between a national government, a true nation founded on the individual Americans united into the American people, or to remain a confederation, a loose central government, really as the instrument of sovereign states. Now, as I said in my lectures on the Constitutional Convention and the Convention and the Constitution, that the Constitution attempted three new things, and as Wilson points out, this is what he calls the new federalism, a kind of a mixed system between a pure national government and a pure confederation. Well, we know that the Constitution chose a strong national government, and that's been the focus of American life ever since, to some degree. But how did it retain elements of a confederal system where the states have sovereignty and and how did that result in the final Constitution? You could say that there were two primary ways that the Constitution tried to create a new federalism, where some of the sovereignty of the nation would exist at the core and would be the supreme element, but also important aspects of political life would not be settled or on the national level. And it seems to me that there are two primary ways that the Constitution does this. It has structural elements of a confederation left in it, primarily as we saw in the Constitutional Convention during the Great Compromise with the Senate, where what's represented in the Senate are not the American people. The American people, strictly speaking, are represented in the House. They are represented, the states are represented in the Senate. Each state gets 2 senators no matter population. And that means in some ways the states are not simply subdivisions of the national government. They are in some ways independent political entities. They have semi-sovereignty. Also, in the amendment process, we saw that even though Congress can originate amendments, and all of the 27 existing amendments have been originated through Congress, the states can also originate amendments, and ultimately it's the states as states that ratify amendments. 3/4 of the state legislatures or 3/4 of state ratifying conventions must ratify amendments. So the amendment process is essentially a confederal process. Also, the Electoral College, as we shall see, is in some ways what the best way, at least I found, to explain the Electoral College, even the controversies that attend it today, is that it turns the single national presidential election into a state-by-state election, where candidates for the presidency have to amass states. They have to win states rather than the whole nation as a whole. Now, there are arguments for and against both sides of that, as you'll see, but those are the structural elements that respect the states not as derivative parts of the national government, but as I said, semi-sovereign independent units. Probably the most important feature of the Constitution that tries to find a balance between sovereignty concentrated at the national level and state sovereignty is the enumeration of powers in Article 1, Section 8. And as we'll see, much of the debate about the scope of the national government turns on how to interpret those enumerated or listed powers. The Constitution grants, in Article 1, Section 1, when it says all legislative powers herein granted, it points to the enumeration as the source of the national government's powers. And that means there are some things which the national government can't legislate on. Because an enumeration, which is just a fancy word for listing, when you list something, it also implies that you are not listing something. So that, as we'll see, the question of how to interpret those specific 17 granted powers, and in some ways the most controversial of them all, the 18th power, which is called the Necessary and Proper Clause, has been a focus of our national attention really since the beginning. So why again is this important? Why is this an important question? And why does it somehow seem to be at the focus of American life? In order to see the importance of the question, what I'd like to do is structure this like a debate. Put the arguments for a strong, vigorous, powerful national government to the fore. Or actually, what I'm starting is actually with just the opposite, with the goods of small local community or state sovereignty. The idea that government is best when it's left on the local level. We'll let the two powerful voices come forward and make that argument. One was Centinel, who was an anti-federalist, more about him in a minute, and of course Thomas Jefferson, who, even though Thomas Jefferson supported the Constitution and was our third president, he was always an advocate of the argument that that the best of American life happened at the local level and should remain there and should be focused there. And then, with respect to the goods of a strong national government, what better spokesperson than Hamilton? And we'll see in Federalist 11, probably the most powerful statement for America as a vigorous, almost an imperial power. Not quite, but and then after seeing the arguments for strong local government, or that a government is best when attached to people on a local level, what by the way will be the small republic argument that the anti-federalists essentially advocated, and then the argument for the strong national government. The question is where's the balance? And on Wednesday, we'll turn to that question by looking at the sources, the two primary limitations of the states within our system. And we'll look at the great court case, McCulloch v. Maryland, which Wilson talks about in Chapter 3. And you should coordinate that discussion with McCulloch v. Maryland. And also, we'll return to the Lincoln-Douglas debates, where they spoke of this issue. In some ways, state sovereignty versus national sovereignty was the issue, one of the issues in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And then last, we'll turn on Friday to two interesting contemporary statements that even in a time when we've turned to the national government and increased its power over the last really 100 years, but perhaps 50 to 70 years, certainly since the New Deal, that in some ways we should reinvigorate the states and the local governments as a part of American life. That in some ways, perhaps a reinvigoration of smaller and local community may be an answer to some of the dystopias which we're facing. So, and then on Friday we'll also end with a consideration of some of the material in Chapter 3 about how federalism practically works out in today's world. So that's how we'll go over the next week. So let's turn to the argument that government is best attached to the small and local community. Centinel was a Pennsylvania anti-federalist and generally argued, of course, the small republic argument, as we'll see, and would have preferred that the Constitution not be ratified. He opposed, obviously, the ratification of the Constitution. And in a series of newspaper essays in Pennsylvania, he laid out the case. Now, in this essay, it's interesting because even though he opposes the erection of the large Madisonian republic that we saw defended in Federalist 10, he has a certain agreement with Madison. And it's that agreement with Madison that actually begins the basis of his disagreement. He agrees with Madison that people in office, power holders, have a tendency to govern for their own interest. And by the way, Centinel says that this isn't just a tendency in America. This is a tendency in all governments, that office holders have a tendency to want to accrue their power for their own self-interest. So in some ways, you could say there was this broader consensus at the time of the founding that human beings are motivated by self-interest, and that the problem with politics and government is that you give some power to some people and they'll use that power for their self-interest. Well, both Madison and Centinel agree that that's an issue that won't go away. It's rooted in human nature. But they do disagree on the solutions, whereas Madison would advocate a complex government of separated powers and checks and balances, so that the power holders and their ambition is what checks their ambition, that the self-interest of office holders is balanced and checked by each other in a complex system of government, is what keeps government attended to the public purpose. For Centinel, his alternative instead is a twofold one. Even though people generally don't pay attention to the government, and in some ways that's true then and true now, his argument is the solution is to make the government structurally simple. So simplicity is one. So if the people don't pay attention to politics very much, the solution is to make the government so simple in structure that they can follow it without that much attention. Now, the other solution, of course, is to keep government local and attached to the people on a local level. In what sense and why? Again, Centinel argues that if the government is kept on a local level, those are issues that people will understand. So one is the simple grasp of the issues of politics. If you move towards a strong national government, active and participant in foreign affairs, you'll eventually involve aspects of governance that most people just don't have an understanding of or grasp of. And you could say, in some ways, that's always been the case in American life, that foreign affairs have often been a critical issue, especially in the 20th century. But Sentinel's argument is people understand what's in front of them. And if you keep government simple and on the local level, it will deal with the issues that they understand. Also, to some degree, he argues there's a certain diversity of goods, that Spartanburg is not the same political community as New York City, and that therefore, if you keep government on the local level, government can attend to the differences in people's lives, and that sort of diversity of local interests. He argues that representatives from a small community are better known, and if and that the real check on the tendency of representatives, elected officials, to steer from the public good is to keep keep their constituents' awareness of them as high as possible, and therefore, if you represent a smaller number of people, they can come to know you better. Now, in some ways, you'll see the main argument that he makes as to why government should remain on the local level and simple, but primarily local, is an argument that he'll share with Thomas Jefferson, which we'll come to in a minute. And that is, only if government is kept on the local level can people participate in it. And it's the idea of actual participation, not for instance, in the federal Constitution, the most frequent participation that is demanded of the American people, strictly speaking, is voting for the House of Representatives every 2 years, where you walk into a ballot box or a voting booth and cast a vote for representative. That's the most intense involvement, in some ways, that the Constitution calls for from American citizens. So Sentinel would say, no, for people to be genuinely free, they must be genuinely active and participate in their government. And for that to happen, government has to remain relatively local. Otherwise, the issues of government and the seat of government will become so far in distance that people can't become aware of it, control it, or participate in it. Now, Jefferson, of course, was not an anti-federalist, and Jefferson, in fact, was in Paris as our ambassador during the Constitutional Convention. So when he returned, Washington asked him to be a Secretary of State, and he did, in fact, serve as Washington's Secretary of State, with Hamilton as Washington's Secretary of Treasury. And there was quite a battle within the Washington administration until Jefferson resigned, eventually, by the way, to return to serve as Vice President and then President. So, what's Jefferson proposing in this essay? His proposal is the creation of a tiny unit of local government called wards. And how big would these wards be? He suggests 6 miles by 6 miles. That's a pretty small unit of government. And it's not, of course, that he's advocating the dissolution of the national government. As I said, he was our president, and in some ways he was a strong president. But on this question, he thinks that the aim of the proper division of authority in government is to find that level of government to which each level is competent to the task. So he wants to create tiny wards of 6 miles by 6 miles. And what kinds of things would he give to it? Well, things like schools, the poor, welfare, police functions, and even to some degree military functions. Because his argument is, if you really participate in the government around you, you will become attached to it. And for the founding generation, this was the great advantage of popular government, where, as opposed to a monarchy or an aristocracy, where people obeyed the government in some ways because of power. Now, of course, the government in a republic has to have power too. But the argument is the great advantage of a republican form of government, or a popular form of government, is since the people participate in it, they obey it because its laws are seen as emanating from them. And so, in some ways, Jefferson wants to take that capacity of attachment, devotion to, what you might call patriotic sentiment, and foster it by creating such small little incubators of participation and attachment that, as he says, you wouldn't have to have a large standing army, because in a country where people were so attached to their way of life, because it is their way of life and they actually do govern themselves, that will be the strongest form of defense. So you see in both of these authors the main argument for small local government. It's government that people understand, they can supervise, they can watch it, it deals with issues that they understand, and in some ways it is the ground of Republican or popular government because people are essentially attached to and devoted to their society. And the argument is if government moves away from that level, eventually people will cease to understand it, they will cease to be able to control it, and ultimately they will become less citizens, as we'll see, than say clients. That's the issue that we'll come back to on Friday. So in response to that, of course, let's let Hamilton come forward. Now, to remind you, Federalist 11, to no one's great shock, comes after Federalist 10. And in that first section of the Federalist Papers, remember, the essays are devoted to explaining how and why a strong, powerful union would be a benefit to America. And of course, Federalist 10 by Madison, the previous paper, launches the great argument and for the huge, diverse commercial republic of multiple factions. So it's in Federalist 11, Hamilton comes back to the question of why it's in the interest of America to strengthen the Union. And as you'll see, it's a fairly powerful argument for having American government be a strong, vigorous, centralized national government. So what are the goods of concentrating power in the national government? Remember, one of the issues in the Confederation was the inability of the national government to regulate commerce. So, with a strong national government, with a strong commercial policy, Hamilton argues that the nation will become more prosperous. And you'd have to say that was probably a valid argument then. It's probably a valid argument now. It somewhat explains the rise of the European community, and which began in the 1950s after the issues of World War II have subsided. It began as the common market. The reason that Europe has moved towards unity, or at least some kinds of continental unity in terms of a currency, the euro, and is because the European Union, because in some ways they grasped that a more continental unified commercial policy would increase the overall prosperity of the European continent. So this is probably a true argument. And in fact, once Congress was able to regulate national commerce, the nation's prosperity did grow. Once you have a strong national government with a unified commercial policy over the whole continent, our prosperity will grow. That, in turn, he argues, will lead to the ability of the national government to accrue revenue. And as we'll see in today's government, one of the arguments for increasing the power of the national government is because it has resources of revenue that the states just don't have. In addition, of course, the power to coin money. So a prosperous nation with a strong national government will lead to an efficient and increased use of revenue, which will enable us to acquire military strength, especially naval strength. So a strong, powerful navy, which will guard our interests in the world. And of course, America does have the world's most extensive and powerful navy. Britain at one time, of course, played that role. But Hamilton's right that in some ways, having a prosperous nation with an efficient and increased source of national revenue will increase our ability to project our national strength and protect our interests, both in the military and general naval and general military. Now, his last argument is a kind of an interesting one. Without a strong union, it's not just that we won't be prosperous. It's not just that we won't have an increased revenue base and have increased national military and naval strength. Hamilton argues that only with a strong union, a strong, powerful national government, is something like national greatness possible. Let me read the last paragraph, which is an interesting paragraph. So there are other points of view in which this subject might be placed, of a striking and animating kind. but they would lead us too far into regions of futurity and would involve topics not proper for a newspaper discussion. I shall briefly observe that our situation invites and our interests prompt us to aim at an ascendant in the system of American affairs. The world may politically as well as geographically be divided into 4 parts, each having a distinct set of interests. Unhappily for the other 3, Europe, by her arms and by her negotiations, by force and by fraud, has, in different degrees, extended her dominion over them all. Asia, Africa, and America have successfully felt her domination. The superiority she has long maintained has tempted her to plume herself as mistress of the world, and to consider the rest of mankind as created for her benefit. Men admired as profound philosophers have, in direct terms, attributed to her inhabitants physical superiority, and have gravely asserted that all animals, and with them the human species, degenerate in America. He must have been talking about New Jersey. Just kidding. That even dogs cease to bark after having breathed a while in our atmosphere. Facts have too long supported these arrogant pretensions of the Europeans. It belongs to us to vindicate the honor of the human race, and to teach that assuming brother moderation. Union will enable us to do it. Disunion will add another victim to his triumphs. Let Americans disdain to be the instruments of European greatness. Let the 13 states, bound together in a strict and indissoluble union, concur in erecting one great American system, superior to the control of all transatlantic force or influence, and able to dictate the terms of the connection between the old and the new world. This is a stirring call for America to become a great nation, to enter into world affairs as a master of its own fate, but also a kind of a vindication of the honor of the human race against European greatness. Now, you could say that that most nations can't aspire to this kind of greatness. It really does require a massive amount, almost like imperial forces. So you'd have to say that, and I'd say that Hamilton was probably prescient about this, and that in some ways the nation that we've become is the nation that he was looking forward to. Most observers would call the 20th century, and perhaps the 20th century, the American century. So this promise of national greatness, Hamilton is absolutely correct. Had we not had a vigorous national government at the core of our national life, the promise of greatness would never have ever really been available to us. So in some ways, this is what a strong, powerful, centralized national government will give you: prosperity, revenue, military strength, and even national greatness. Now, if you were listening to this in 1787, 1788, or even now, you could say this. Sure, Rome was an empire. The People's Republic of China is clearly aspiring to the kind of greatness that Hamilton is talking about. Yet, if that kind of national greatness, or even kind of prosperity or military strength, if it meant that in some decisive ways that American freedom, American self-governance would be sacrificed to the erection of a strong, powerful national government, you could say maybe it's not worth it. So, as we'll see, the Constitution is premised on the notion that you can have both of these kinds of goods. You can have a strong, powerful national government, and you can also have a local, vigorous state government. Again, the new federalism tries to find a balance between those two goods. So, how does it do that? Again, as we'll see, the argument that the Constitution creates a strong national government, supreme, is bound together with the idea that there are limits on both the national government and the state powers within that system. So the first question we'll turn to on Wednesday then is, what's the proper balance with respect to the power of the national government? Again, the Constitution creates a national government that is supreme. Ultimately, sovereignty does rest with the national government, final sovereignty, but it's supreme within its sphere. And as we'll see, that turns on how you interpret the scope of the national government's principles, powers, in Article 1, Section 8, the enumeration of powers. And as I said, the other limit that we'll see, so we'll see that McCulloch v. Maryland points to one kind of limit of state power within the national government, and we'll see the Lincoln-Douglas debates points to another limit on state power. That is to say, why within the mix of federal and state powers that there have to be limits on the states, and what are those limits? We'll see them on Wednesday. Again, on Friday, we'll turn to two essays that suggest that local and state government is still a vital part of the constitutional system and, in fact, should be invigorated. And as I said, we'll turn to some issues in Wilson Chapter 3 that discuss how federalism works out in today's world on a practical level.